to participants in this conference. It is indeed my pleasure to be asked to chair this session and to be able to welcome initially Professor Adebayo Olukoshi, who is a distinguished professor at VIT. Later on to welcome Professor Jimmy Adeshina, Dr. Kaja Huyo, and Professor Tejiwa Meiwa, the Vice Principal at the University of South Africa, who will be presiding over the closing ceremony of this particular conference. I have roughly 1.5 hours for this exercise. And I believe that as a starting point, I think we should invite Professor Adebayo Olukoshi to join us for his keynote address, closing keynote address, which focuses on the theme, Social Policy for Sustained Democratic Governance. I think, Professor Olukoshi, it might be nice for us to see you, even if only for a moment, so that for those ones who have not had the chance to put face to name, excellent, we can see you. So before I invite you to speak, Professor Olukoshi, I need to mention that you are also former Executive Secretary of CODESRIA, the 5th Executive Secretary of CODESRIA, former Director at EDEP in Dakar, and you just finished your tour of duty at International IDEA in Addis Ababa, having led the Africa Regional Office. Obviously, anyone who is attending this conference will know the contribution you made to knowledge, ranging from a whole range of topics, matters, democratic governance, economic policy. Some may not know you've written previously on industrialization policy. You have spoken on the land question, a vast range of topics for which I believe put you in good position to speak to the topic of today, which is to restate social policy for sustained democratic governance. Professor Olukoshi, I'm handing over this to you, and please take it away.
Thank you very much indeed, Chair of the closing session of this particular session, Dr. Godwin Murunga, my Ndugu, as I always fondly refer to you. Thank you for the warm welcome to this session. And I will leave my video running for a few minutes, but I have to switch it off because I'm on battery power, haven't lost electricity some moments ago. And I guess to conserve some of that battery power, I'll crave the indulgence of you and of all the participants to be able to speak off camera, but hoping that I'll be as audible and as clear as possible under the circumstances. Let me also thank Professor Adeshina, but also yourself from CODESRIA, and the colleagues at UNRIST, alongside the SACHI chair of social policy, which Jimmy Adeshina leads at UNISA, for the kind invitation extended to me to be part of this conversation. It has been a veritable festival over the last 3 days. I had opportunities to tune in to some of the sessions and some of the presentations, highly educative and insightful. And I imagine that what I'll be saying in this closing substantive session of the 3 days intellectual Indaba will really be more of building on what has already been said, as well as work which has been done over the years, not least by UNRIST and by Jimmy Adeshina and colleagues who have been very active in the domain of building our knowledge and understanding of the imperatives of social policy in the making of the modern state system. And in doing so, I, preparatory to this presentation, had occasion to revisit some of the recent writings of colleagues of the likes of Yusuf Bangura, of Sheila Bunwari, and even outside of the African continent, looking at comparative insights that have emerged around the topic from Asia and Latin America. Some quite interesting work on the Brazilian experience. And I would assume that these pioneering efforts, particularly the book on social policy, which was compiled by Yusuf Bangura, published in 2007, with studies from various parts of the world, offer us a good basis on which to build, and in so doing to interrogate particularly the African continental experience on which I propose to focus in this presentation. And my starting point is probably also my conclusion, which is the basic proposition. I don't think it will be controversial, that if Africa's experiment with democratization is to evolve to a point of sustainability, or what students of democracy sometimes refer to as consolidation, the social policy component of the African developmental experience will have to be strengthened and made a core part of the efforts at building democratic governance on the continent. And as I said, I don't think this would be in itself anything that would be controversial. But let me unpack that conclusion and work my way backwards by taking us to the period 3 decades or more ago, when the current transition to democratization began on the African continent. And many of us will recall that that process, beginning with the movements, popular protests that enveloped the Republic of Benin, often cited as the trigger point of what some have referred to as Africa's entry into the third wave of global democratization. The popular protests in Benin were to become both symbolic and serve as a trigger of that transitional process from an authoritarian era into a new phase of political evolution on the continent. But it came against the backdrop, and it needs to be emphasized, of more than 2 decades of economic crisis and structural adjustment on the African continent. Economic crisis which began on the back of a payments problem, the problem of balance of payments, which in itself was also compounded by an external debt crisis, the 1982 so-called Mexican weekend, when Mexico defaulted on its loan repayments, and that default creating a contagion effect that was to envelope much of the global financial system and set in motion a series of panic measures by key financial players, which in turn refracted itself into the African continent as a problem of external debt servicing that became generalized over time beyond a balance of payments problem to a broader economic crisis. That crisis became the foundation on which structural adjustment made its entry into the African policy space, underwritten by the IMF and the World Bank, going way beyond the initial austerity measures which African countries had themselves initiated in response to the early days of the economic crisis that confronted them, and which by definition was supposed to be a more holistic intervention aimed at carrying out a complete economic reset and recalibration. The thrust of the adjustment programs, as we all know and will recall, indeed, we are still living with structural adjustment, even if the name itself may have changed over time. But the thrust of the adjustment programs was by definition also deflationary, given the neoliberal foundations on which they were conceived. And they culminated in a determined effort to undertake a retrenchment of the state, and along with it, whatever was available or left of the social policy of the state. I think it's important for us to keep this point in mind about not just simply a determined, even doctrinaire effort under the rubric of structural adjustment to cut the state, the post-colonial states, down to size and limit it to what Tandika in his days referred to as the night watchman role, simply providing basic security for citizens and for investors in particular, but otherwise leaving the terrain to the so-called free forces of the market. This actually went hand in hand with a retrenchment of social policy, some of which actually comprised an important part of the gains of the post-colonial period, of the gains of independence. Social policy measures coming in various forms and shapes, in which many African governments, as they achieved independence, invested heavily from the health sector to the educational sector, but even to broader institutions of economic and social development that may not have been defined specifically or explicitly as performing a social policy function, but which in fact were multitasked institutions that became part and parcel of the broader fabric of social cohesion and of the kinds of progress and mobility that characterized the first decade or two of independence. And it was this complex of social policy interventions of the early post-colonial period that the IMF World Bank structural adjustment programs particularly targeted for dismantling alongside the retrenchment of the state. The consequences of the structural adjustment years were multifaceted. They are very familiar. I'm not going to dwell too much on them, except to note, particularly in conversation with the writings of Sheila Bunwari and Yusuf Bangura and others, that one immediate consequence was the de-industrialization of African economies, and on the back of it, a massive problem of unemployment, the decimation of the historic middle class of the post-colonial period, and so on and so forth. Consequences which basically added up in the context of the attempts to balance budgets, cut the public expenditure, including particularly the social expenditure of the state, introduce cost recovery measures, basically a metaphor for an increase in the price of social services that was still available, and user fees and all of the language that was invented by the IMF and the World Bank to push through their agenda of the retrenchment of the state and of social policy. But all of this culminated in an expansion in the boundaries of poverty and a rapid expansion in inequality across many of the countries of Africa as the adjustment years progressed. And in order to enforce adjustment, again, an issue which those of us who have studied this period in Africa's history would recall, that in order to enforce adjustment, which was supposed to be a rational set of policies, the way it was marketed, that was good for Africans and for African countries. There was really no hesitation in resorting to a range of authoritarian political regimes, beginning first with the conditionality and cross-conditionality clauses of the IMF and the World Bank, supported by bilateral donors and even private creditors organized in the London Club, basically copying their Paris Club counterparts, working in tandem with the IMF and the World Bank to create conditionality and cross-conditionality clauses that were authoritarian by definition and were defined essentially to compel African countries to embrace structural adjustment, leaving them essentially with absolutely no alternative than the embrace of structural adjustment. And as regimes embraced structural adjustment and came against domestic resistance and opposition, including from trade unions and from a range of social movements and civil society groups that began to flourish at the time, intellectual resistance also coming from the African Academy, but also sites like the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. In the face of such resistance, we simply saw a strengthening domestic governance processes. Very much, I think, in line with the prediction which was made by the chief economist of the Africa Development Department of the World Bank at the time, a certain Deepak Lal, who, to quote him, said that effective, ruthless governments able to ride roughshod on public opinion were absolutely necessary for the successful implementation of structural adjustment measures. So governments confronted with domestic opposition, the phenomenon of the IMF riots of the 1980s that spread across the continent as adjustment measures were enforced, and which even resulted in the collapse of a few governments. Some might remember the fall of Numeri, of President Numeri of Sudan, was a direct result of the anti-IMF riots that enveloped Khartoum and other major cities of the country and paved the way for a military coup d'etat to replace him. But also places like Egypt, in Cairo, where following an IMF mission and an increase in the price of bread, widespread opposition and protests gave the Mubarak regime at the time a first taste of what was later to become, I think, the Arab Spring that brought about the fall of that government. So IMF riots became ubiquitous across the continent, suppressed by governments that were themselves laboring under the weight of conditionality and cross-conditionality clauses in order to appear to be faithful to the goals of structural adjustment and therefore be able to access loans and relief capital offered to them by the IMF and the rescheduling of debts by the Paris and London clubs, creating a vicious cycle, as it were, that effectively meant a new round of repression over and above what military regime and single party rule may have meant, as this also became the vogue across the continent from the late 60s through much of the 1970s. Amidst all of the political instability, of course, was also the organization by various movements, both openly and underground, trade unions, students associations, students unions, various women's groups, basically contesting the authority of increasingly draconian and unrepresentative governments, and resulting in the manifestations which we saw in Cotonou, sustained over weeks on end, demanding an end to single party and military rule and the opening up of the political space. The resistance to structural adjustment effectively became the harbinger of the emergence of democracy movements that effectively ushered Africa into the so-called global third wave of democratization. And a lot of hope was placed on this transition. You might remember that some commentators, particularly enjoy citing Colin Legume in this regard, because he's somebody who, from early on, had made investments of intellectual effort in tracking political developments on the continent in the period from late colonialism right up to the 1990s, when these demonstrations resulted in the fall of long-established single-party and military governments. Colin Legume celebrating what was happening, the transition that was underway, as nothing less than a second liberation, on the argument that if the first liberation was Africa's freedom from colonial rule, the second liberation was the beginning of freedom from authoritarian government across the continent, and the hope that this might be the beginning of a new phase that will usher in representative government of a kind that will be accountable to the populace and able also to formulate policies that will be responsive to the internal dynamics of many of the countries of the continent. The champions of the protests against authoritarian governance were themselves very careful to insist in a lot of cases, and that translated itself into the sovereign national conferences which we saw, to insist that it was not going to be simply a matter of cosmetic changes in the administration of public affairs, but rather a wholesale restructuring of the political system in order to ensure that empowered citizens are able to occupy the driver's seat. And so through the sovereign national conferences, we saw a whole host of initiatives ranging from a rewriting of constitutions, in some of the best examples, to the reconstitution of the electoral system, including the enabling of autonomous election management bodies, the licensing of a new multi-party political order to underpin the new system of, or the reinstated system of electoral pluralism, rules about the opening up of spaces for citizen participation, the right to demonstrate, the right to assembly, the right to association, and all of which fed into a period of efflorescence in civil society life across the continent during the 1990s and beyond. And I think the early signs that came from the transition would have perhaps suggested to many that Africa may have finally made a qualitative break with the authoritarian past, as we began to see an alternation of power, long ruling, live presidencies replaced through popular elections by a new set of actors who came to occupy the center stage, as electoral pluralism threw up one surprise after the other. I guess for many of us, the voting out of the United National Independence Party of Kenneth Kaunda in Zambia was perhaps symbolic of the kinds of shifts that were to take place in many other countries of the continent, both as long-ruling presidents and ruling parties or military dictatorships, or indeed even diarchical military-civilian arrangements that dominated power gave way in most places to a new set of political actors brought into power on the strength of an electoral pluralism that also showed signs of strengthening itself over time. Sometimes I think to a point where issues of electoral integrity that had previously been a major concern of citizens appeared in some instances to become something of the past. I'll cite here the notable example of Ghana, where the quality of elections improved significantly from one electoral cycle to the other. And at the third or fourth level, instances of the emergence of what in international idea we used to refer to as programmatic political parties. Parties built on the basis of a clear program of action and anchored in some instances on a broad ideological orientation, as against the parties of old that were dominated by personalities and which basically functioned with little or no programmatic agenda or vision of societal transformation to speak of. So broadly speaking, this seemed to be a process of transition that set Africa on the right path, as it were. But it was really not too many years after, even before the dawn of the new millennium, that we began to see many of the discontents associated with the system of electoral pluralism that was instituted on the back of the transitions of the early 1990s. And here I think it's important for us to reconnect back to the issues of governance and social policy. It's important for us to interrogate why by the end of the first decade of the transitions, Africans began to feel that the democracy in which they had invested so much did not seem to be capable of delivering any of the key dividends of improvements in livelihoods, of advancement, of mobility, and of overall citizen well-being and empowerment. And this question important to put side by side with the fact that even on the issues of a technical nature, such as the alternation of power or the integrity of elections, we also began to witness significant setbacks, setbacks which manifested themselves by the first decade of the new millennium in the abandonment of term limitation, for example, and attempts by several presidents, incumbents, in not less than 13 African countries by the end of the first decade of the new millennium, basically wanting to stay in office, hold on to power indefinitely, and doing away with the term limitation. That was an important element of the citizen rejection of life presidencies that had been at the heart of some of the conversations in negotiating a new post-authoritarian order on the continent. By the same token, we saw election management bodies increasingly undermined, or in some cases, their leadership compromising their independence and throwing up the familiar questions of fraud in the electoral process of the kind which basically undermines the credibility of the electoral process. And I can cite many other examples of the failings of the democratic transition, even on the terms on which it was unfolded in the 1990s, not to talk of other components that can be summarized under the rubric of the dividends of democracy in the social and the economic domain, which seems to have eluded most governments, in spite of the fact that alternation of power continued to take place in at least a significant number of countries on the continent. First and foremost in this regard, I think, is for us to remember that many of the elected governments came into office with the expectation, at least from the Bretton Woods institutions, that they would use their newly acquired legitimacy to continue to push the agenda of structural adjustment, which by definition was an agenda of deflation and austerity. And here, therefore, we are confronted with a situation in which elected governments, regardless of what political party they represented, regardless of what alternation of power may take place from one regime to the other across the electoral cycle, were basically stuck with the same set of social and economic policies, no longer referred to as structural adjustment, but bearing all of the hallmarks of a neoliberal program of adjustment around which they were expected to function, and for which many of them really had little or no alternative. This is in fact the paradox that led Thandikam Kandawire to describe Africa's new democracies as essentially choiceless democracies, democracies in which citizens, on the basis of promises of politicians, vote parties into power and alternate power between one party and the other, between one incumbent and the other, even voting in historic opposition parties into office, or finding themselves essentially stuck with the same set of policies, social and economic policies, that basically reinforced poverty and inequality across much of the continent. This choicelessness that Thandika referred to, I think, underscores also the absence of autonomous policy spaces for social and economic decision-making by elected government in Africa, functioning in a lot of cases under direct and indirect external agencies of restraint, and unable in a lot of cases to produce the kinds of economic and social policies that we would normally describe as heterodox policies. And I would like to come back to this a bit later on, the relationship between democracy and heterodoxy in the policy process. But certainly in the African context, elected government became the enforcer of an old orthodoxy that ran in the face even of the goals of the consolidation of democracy, let alone the questions of the advancement of the welfare of a citizenry that had seen its social and economic lot decimated for almost 3 decades continuously, beginning from the early 1980s through into the new millennium. Effectively, therefore, we also found a situation in which, as our democratic journey progressed, as the rituals of elections took place, poverty, unemployment, inequality became essentially the drivers of a broad disempowerment of citizens, a disempowerment which effectively meant that citizens became vulnerable to a whole host of discontents in the political system, vulnerability to the godfathers of so-called democratic politics who were able to buy the vote, including outrightly buying voters' cards, as to effectively disempower the electorate. A disempowerment which manifested itself in the course of the first decade of the new millennium, and led to several commentators to note that increasingly elections in Africa amounted to exercises in voting without choosing. Voting without choosing. We go through the rituals of voting, but in actual fact, we are not exercising much choice in the electoral process, not only because of the choicelessness which Tandika and Kandawiro observed with Africa's new democracies in his writings summarizing the African experience of democratization, but also in terms of the fact that citizens went into the electoral process essentially as disempowered individuals who were basically cannon fodder for political gladiators in a context of massive disempowerment, in which the vote really was essentially for sale to the highest bidder in a lot of cases. For the Nigerians who are in this conversation, you'll be familiar with the notion of the stomach infrastructure that was used to capture this situation of citizen disempowerment, of terribly impoverished, even citizens living in a state of immiseration on a scale never before experienced, and therefore vulnerable to all of the any manner that was thrown in their direction, comprising bags of rice or basic household commodities made available to the electorate on the eve of voting, and effectively buying the conscience of the voting population. And in the context of all of this, we also see the opening up of the social and political space to the entry of a range of other actors outside of the state as such, with a state that was increasingly absent, crime and criminality, an underground economy, openness to radicalization, as is often referred to in the literature, a radicalization that spoke of a new era of extremism in which vulnerable citizens for as little as the equivalent of $5 are recruited into the ranks of various insurgency groups, including those of them proclaiming a peculiar interpretation of Islam, such as Boko Haram, and constituting the fighting force of such insurgency movements in search of a new meaning within the political space, of the emergence of militias of various kinds, of violence of a xenophobic nature, side by side with a resurgence in ethno-regional identities and extremities of a kind that also challenge the idea and the ideal of the secular nation state project of the independence period, as well as gender-based violence, which we also, from all of the documented evidence, have seen grown by leaps and bounds from decade after decade in the period since the onset of democratic transition in the early 1990s. So basically, we are inheritors of a process and a system in which we have attempted to build democratic governance, but to do so on the basis of a minimalist state and a state that itself is completely or increasingly absent from the social arena. And I say this despite the fact that initiatives of various kinds, from the MDGs, poverty reduction strategy papers, the current generation of cash transfer initiatives that have been introduced by various governments to try to alleviate poverty and outright misery amongst the citizens. That all of these initiatives undertaken have not really in any meaningful way addressed the question of the role of the state and the importance of a social state in the consolidation of a democratic agenda for the countries of the continent. To the extent to which they have worked, they comprise palliative measures that are too little, miserable in their content, and miserly in terms of what they offer. In South Africa, where the SPiA is located, we talk of about 350 rands in cash transfers. And in other jurisdictions, that amount is even much lower when compared to the 350 rands in terms of current exchange rates, amounts which really do not make any dent of a significant kind in the levels of poverty, of immiseration, of exclusion, and which I think should warn us to the fact that to the extent to which Africa might be able to consolidate a system of democratic governance, the challenge which confronts us today is one of ensuring that the democratic project is built not just on the mechanics of elections and of constitution making, but on a social pact, which puts the social expenditure of the state as a central component of citizen empowerment, understanding that empowered citizens also make for a functioning electoral and constitutional process of the kind that will bring about the integrity, the accountability, and the representation which we wish to see in our political systems. A social pact will also be an important component of the rebuilding of social cohesion in most of our countries in the context of the extreme poverty and inequality to which I have referred, and all of the negative consequences in a revival of xenophobia, of ethno-regional politics, of religious extremism, and so on and so forth, banditry, and criminality of various kinds that we currently live with, and which basically underwrites what some have referred to as the new season of anomie with which we are confronted. So looking forward in terms of our quest for an alternative, my claim, my argument is that Africa's quest for democratic consolidation can certainly not have content and meaning if it is bereft of a social compact, of a social component, which in terms of what we know of what works and what does not work by way of good practices of a comparative nature from around the world, will be a social pact that is anchored on a universality that makes it possible for different categories of citizens to be able to build a new sense of national identity and belonging without fear of stigma or discrimination in the enjoyment of their rights. And I would like to propose that in terms of our own research agenda and policy dialogues, these are issues which we need to bring to the fore of conversations as a way out of our season of anomie. The temptation in some instances to resort to a return to military rule, as we have seen in parts of West Africa may provide temporary feeling of relief for the populace. But whether military, authoritarian rule, or elected government that is bereft of a social anchorage, we will in fact be confronted with the same problems of anomie unless we rethink our systems and processes of democratic governance in a manner that will ensure that the empowerment of citizens becomes the primary purpose of whatever reforms that are undertaken. And I'm not unaware, of course, that the basic economic conditions for the promotion of a socially pacted democratic system of governance is an important one to which we need to pay attention. My comfort in this regard is essentially that the same reasons that make it impossible for us to have robust social policies as part of the ongoing processes of democratization are also those same reasons that make it impossible for most African countries to develop meaningful trade and industrial policies of the kind that can unleash economic potentialities, and enhance domestic value addition through beneficiation, for example, of natural resources, and so on and so forth. We are dealing with the same basic challenge of policy and of the choices which are made by those who hold power as part of a broad transnational power coalition that is bent on enforcing a global system of neoliberalism in the administration of public affairs. And here, I think, for those of us who follow the conversation, the issues which are joined in the struggle that we are confronted with are fairly straightforward. The agenda of ensuring that politics and social policy are disciplined to the demands of so-called rational economics is still an ongoing agenda. And nobody put it better than Larry Summers, a Democratic politician, by the way, in terms of his affiliation in the United States, not a Republican, was certainly one of the best exponents of this global neoliberal agenda when he argued as chief economist and vice president of the World Bank that economists know what it takes to grow an economy. And they have developed the rational set of policy interventions required to sustain economic growth over a long run. What they have not yet succeeded in doing, but which they must do for the sake of rationality in policy making, is to ensure that politics doesn't mess things up. In other words, there's still a push, as it were, for politics, regardless of the pluralism that underpins it, to produce only an orthodox outcome. Whereas, in fact, democratic politics, if it functioned properly in any system, in any society, regardless of the level of development, should, in fact, be the propeller of heterodoxy in policymaking, as different interest groups in interaction with one another attempt to forge out compromises of a kind that would ensure that at least a majority of the populace are able to line up behind a consensus that is agreed upon for a season. And it is, I think, again here that we need to begin to insist in our arguments that democratic politics is not about uniformizing either political life or social and economic policy, but of producing what in the old Maoist language, a situation in the public sphere where 1,000 flowers can bloom, interact with one another freely, and produce the kinds of mixes of policy that at least will ensure that we are able to proceed on the basis of an heterodox agenda as opposed to an enforced orthodoxy that basically might mean the collapse of the current nation-state project in many of the countries of our continent. I thank you again for the opportunity to share some of these thoughts with you and look forward, if the time permits and the chair allows, to a short conversation around the views which I have presented before you. Thank you very much, Chair, and back to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Lukoshi, and thank you very much for this. I can't find the correct word, but this is really a serious and rigorous survey of the story of what you described as the minimalist state, one that by forces external to it and internal to it has been forced to vacate spaces of economic policy making, spaces of social policy making, and has ceded ground in many ways due to a variety of influences to a new politics that promotes, let's use the word, the democratization of disempowerment, if you will, going back to the favorite phrase that the late Professor Claude Ake wrote about so eloquently. I don't think that I qualify to say any more on this rather than to thank you very much for this excellent, committed, and indeed provocative but inspiring presentation. I think I have a few minutes for a few questions, even though I can see we're running short of time, but I'll try to manage it in such a way that the final segment with the farewell address can also have its time. So if there is anyone who has a quick question, if you want to use the Q&A in the Zoom system, or if you want to raise up your hand and we can pick you out, I think that we have a minute, some time for us to do this. Anyone with a question? Anyone with a comment? I can see Ayo. Can we give her, can we all you time in that order? Ayo? Ayo? Yes, please.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Professor Adebayo, for this very elaborative lecture. I have one particular question, so I just want to hear your opinion on this issue. In a context where we have a fundamental power imbalance between actors, both within and outside the continent, which promote this orthodox political economic thinking, practice, policymaking, and everything, the likes of the think tanks, the civil society organizations, and even academics in Africa. Where do you see that? I believe that everything that you argued for, I agree with it, but I still believe that all these ideas are very much on the margin. And I don't see, so the challenge is, how can we kind of mobilize to push the center and bring these ideas to the policymakers, the decision makers, to the politicians, and even populate these ideas into those practitioners or movement leaders in the think tanks, in the civil society, and the social movement. So I believe that's where probably the challenge is, and I wonder whether you have any comment on that. Thank you.
Can I also take the question from the comment from Rich Sewa?
Thank you very much, and of course, thanks to Prof. Adebayo for this very, very insightful. My name is Richard Sewachilianga from the Center for Basic Research in Uganda. I think for me, the quick point I wanted to ask Prof. Adebayo to really reflect on is this whole point where we say a certain level of metamorphosis of leaders. We know that several leaders in this continent have been, start off as very progressive, and then they end up as totally regressive. Throwing away the ideals, these false questions of social policy, and returning to issues around, autocracy and militarism and all those kinds of things. But I don't know if in your framing, this is something that you can locate around what is it that happens that sort of allows for a backsliding of leaders in terms of their politics and their practice as we go along, because I think that's an area that we cannot explain, especially if you are from Uganda with a 3-decade leader. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Richard. I like the metamorphosis from Richard Kiryanga to Rich Sewa. It feels very rich. Lucas, you want to take on these 2 questions, and we'll see if we have time for another after that.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Richard. We're all from Uganda, and I guess we're all trapped in this in this paradox. Even if our experiences elsewhere on the continent are not as dramatic as the 360 degrees turn that you were all living witnesses of in Uganda. Recall my point about alternation of power, essentially producing what Tandika described as the choicelessness. And I think here the reality is also that for a lot of governments, for a lot of leaders voted into office, they get very, very quickly boxed into narrow policy spaces of the kind which effectively pull them away from what one might call the idealism on the basis of which they came into office, into a very narrow realism, for which I think for many, it basically becomes a comfort zone from which they operate. And the imbalance, if one might call it, between the weight of the external agencies of restraint that pile pressure and basically have hijacked the domestic policy space, and the voices of organized forces within the country to push back is one of those areas where we need to pay much greater attention. Doing so also with a recognition that in the period, for example, since the 80s when we began a process of de-industrialization, we've seen a weakening of traditional social movements, of trade unions, for example, without a corresponding strengthening of the kinds of organized counter-civil society weight that might be able to fill the gap vacated by our traditional students' union, trade unions, and various other social movements that were at the height of the fight against military rule and authoritarianism, and which were able, in many instances, to be the drivers of some of the gains in social policy that we saw in the period after independence. Students insisting, for example, on particular policies with regards to the fees which are charged for secondary and post-secondary education, or trade unions being able to fight effectively for a decent wage, even before the concept itself became fashionable in international and ILO circles, and so on and so forth, to be able to push a broader agenda of a secular state project that is responsible and responsive to the members of society, to build boundaries of solidarity of a kind which also helped to strengthen social cohesion. We've seen a lot of that eroded as part of the project of structural adjustment and the consequences which it had. And so being able to build countervailing forces domestically that will also become veritable sources of pressure on those who come into office and reduce their capacity to ride freely on the back of some so-called international endorsement and legitimacy is one of the tasks which I think confronts us across the board on the continent, including Uganda. And I think this connects with Eyop's question. I think in many respects, Eyop, we have our work cut out for us. It is true that much of what we say, in fact, much of what I have said today, I have had occasion to present before some of our leaders, whether at Tana Forum or at the retreats organized by the AU. And you'll be amazed how many of the political leaders actually would nod in agreement with some of the analysis. And the question, I think, is again, the way in which transnational power is organized and our capacity to be able to build countervailing forces. A development partner, so-called, that seeks to influence the direction of policy for a newly elected government in country X on the African continent comes with an aid package that also involves the supply of policy advisory personnel who basically shape the direction of the choices made by such an elected government, a newly elected government, in a particular way. What I think several institutions on the continent where there are progressive-minded people are seeking to do, also to take the results of research which we conduct beyond the realms of the academy into policy and political spaces, with political parties, with social movements, with elected government, where the opportunity is available, in order to at least put on the table the idea that there are alternatives and things can be done differently, and to remind as many of our policymakers and political leaders as possible that many of those who present themselves as supporters with an altruistic mission are actually nothing more than bad Samaritans. Back to you.
Thank you very much. There is one question that I would like to pick, if you don't mind. There is on the chat Q&A, considering the cost of violent elections on lives and economics, what governance alternatives might we in Africa embrace? Is electoral democracy really for us? Another concerned Ugandan. That is what I have there. Bayo, do you want to take on that?
Okay, well, thank you very much. I would say that for better or for worse, colleagues, I think we are condemned to democracy. Democracy is part of our broad consciousness as human beings. And none of us would like to, if we had the choice, live our lives under conditions of autocracy, of repression, of exclusion, of marginalization, and still beat our chest that we feel able to say that we are part and parcel of a political community as citizens. And part of the struggle which we have waged as Africans from time immemorial is in fact a struggle precisely for this most basic and fundamental of democratic rights. The right to be, the right to belong, and the right to participate in matters that concern us at home and globally. And although political gladiators in our current, as in our previous efforts at democratization, will often enact episodes of violence in their fight for power, I think this in itself is not, in my view, an argument for an abandonment of the basic ideal of democratization. Now, we can have a debate as to whether the particular form of electoral pluralism, which we have embraced as part of this so-called global third wave, is itself the most appropriate. And I've reasoned myself to argue that simply promoting a system of multi-party rule politics without a proper anchorage of such in a broader vision of societal transformation can be both irrelevant and, in the worst cases, irresponsible. Democracy is not an invitation to uniformity. And building our own democracies out of our historical experiences should, in fact, suggest that across the African continent, we would be able to devise varieties of democratic governance of a kind which are responsive to the demands of citizens, whilst simultaneously being open to helping us to push our agenda of structural transformation as a people. Democracy needs to go with development, and our democratic system will have to be anchored also on that vision of structural transformation that we hope will be the path for lifting the bulk of our people out of poverty and misery of the kind which we are confronted with today. Back to you.
Thank you very much indeed for the responses, but also for the lecture. My apologies to anyone else who has a question. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, and I would like to spare some 20 minutes for the closing session, for the farewell addresses from at least 3 speakers. So just to again return my sincere word of thanks to Professor Adebayo Lukoshi, not only for accepting to join us for this particular conference, but also for really dedicating the time, commitment, and energy to speak directly to the theme of the conference and to help us not just remember the memory of the late Thandika Mkandawire, but to also provoke us into thinking in line with the vision, with the ideas that Thandika not only led, but also actually inspired us to think about. And really to thank you also for reinvigorating us into remembering this, but also thinking about possible ways forward in the analysis, not just of social policy, but actually in more specific terms, social policy for a sustained democratic governance. And I think sitting behind your lecture is an invitation for us to commit to a new struggle, because I feel that you essentially have indicated to us that there is almost a cyclical nature in the policy of those forces that are detaining us in many of the things that we want to do and advance the transformation of the continent. And perhaps what we need to do is to find ways of breaking out of this cyclical thing and begin to think autonomously in terms of where we want to take the continent. So really, thank you very much. Hopefully we can pick up some of the outstanding questions in other forums. I would like to take this opportunity, therefore, to redirect our attention to the farewell addresses. The conference that we've just had is jointly organized by the SPiA in social policy at the University of South Africa, in collaboration with UNRIST in Geneva, and of course, with CODESRIA, for whom I'm the executive secretary. And I don't want to come back again at the end to begin to pass my own comments as a final address. I'm going to take this opportunity, first of all, to thank the partners that we have worked with in preparing for this conference. To thank Jimmy Adeshina, Kaja Huyo, for the work that has gone into this. I know there is a whole team of colleagues working with Professor Jimmy Adeshina to make this a successful conference. Some of them in CODESRIA, some of them in UNISA. This is really my final word of thank you for all the excellent work that has gone into this, but also indeed for the intellectual content that went into preparing the conference, but that has also been realized through the various interventions that we've had over the last 3 days. The virtual platform isn't always the best medium of doing this, but at least we continue to do the best in terms of highlighting the issues that we need to be discussing going forward. So really, I am really, really humbled, but also really grateful and privileged to have been associated with this, and on behalf of CODESRIA to have been a part of the agenda of this conference, but most importantly to be able to remember our colleague Professor Thandika Mkandawire, who passed away slightly over a year ago. I want to propose, therefore, that I invite in this particular order the remaining speakers for the farewell address. I would like to ask that in with Kaja Huyo to make your farewell remarks. And please, when you finish, feel free directly to hand over to Professor Jimmy Adeshina to give your final remarks. And Professor Jimmy Adeshina will finally hand over to the Vice Principal at UNISA to make the final remarks. And at that end, I think that we can call it, we can call off the conference. And I want to wish everyone all but on my behalf, on behalf of CODESRIA and on my own behalf, I really want to thank all of you for participating in this conference. Kaja, please.
Thank you very much, Godwin. And yes, dear participants and all the speakers at this Social Policy in Africa 2021 conference. And of course, also dear Jimmy. It has been a very rich 3-day conference, I think, debating and memorizing the legacy of Thandika, former UNRIST director, colleague, friend, mentor, and an inspiring example really for all of us. I think we enjoyed an impressive program featuring the most cutting-edge and topical research on issues of democracy, development, and social policy in Africa. And there was also a special focus on the impacts and responses to the current COVID-19 pandemic, but we never lost the long-term perspective on strategic development pathways for African countries. We had really inspiring keynote speeches by Professor Yayati Ghosh and Professor Adebayo Olokushi that took us through the history and theory to arrive at very pertinent analysis of the present situation and also forward-looking visions about Africa's future in an increasing multipolar, globalized and crisis-ridden world. And I specifically liked also the proposal from Professor Olokushi to construct a new social compact at a social state that empowers citizens, consolidates democracy and promotes development. We had the privilege to join Thandika's family in a shared moment of remembering his life, admirable personality and intellectual journey, and to listen to Professor Fantushere, the inaugural memorial lecture from Thandika on the 7 steps to embark on a transformative, emancipatory nationalist project for African countries, accompanied by a strategic regional and global integration of the continent. And finally, we had also extremely interesting plenary panels and breakout groups. Especially in the breakout groups, I think there were sometimes the most lively discussions taking place. It was good to learn also about important ongoing comparative research initiatives, such as the GATSPA Gender Equitable and Transformative Social Policy for Post-COVID-19 Africa, led by Professor Dodzi Tsikata, and the project on the precarious non-poor in Africa, led by Professor Jimmy Adesina. And finally, before closing from our side, I would like to reiterate my invitation to share with UNRISD your work and to consider research partnerships with us, to join our new network on the Eco-Social Contract and the People's Summit next year. So in closing, a very warm thank you to the organizers and especially Jimmy and his team, as well as Godwin and Kudesria for their support of the conference, and also for supporting the accessibility and dissemination of Thandika's work. It was wonderful to see many old and new faces, and it would have been great to see you all in person, but I hope that this will be possible in future editions. So thank you very much from the side of UNRISD. Take care and keep in touch. Thank you. Over to Jimmy.
All right, thank you, Kaja, and thank you, Godwin, and thank you, Bayo, for the exhilarating closing keynote address. When we initiated this conference series program, in 2017, the idea was to create an autonomous African platform for the debate around the issues of social policy in a way that is innovative and that takes into consideration the unique and specific context of Africa, the way in which we respond to the challenges that we face as people, and to generate new ideas, new conceptual understanding, new normative, framing of social policy. A lot of that has benefited from earlier research that was done at at Kudesria, led by Tadia Akiaino, and the research we did at UNRISD, led by Thandika Mkandawire, which generated in the end the concept of transformative social policy. When we started off, this was a strange idea. This was, a concept that was marginal in the debates. I'm delighted to see the extent to which the propagation as a conceptual tool for making sense of social policy, as an evaluative framework for making sense of social policy. And that, encourages us, to go forward, because it's both at the level of production of knowledge, distinctly grounded in the African context and African reality, and tapping into the history, while at the same time speaking to the global knowledge community and engaging and contributing. As I said in my plenary sessions, the conceptualization of social policy, it's not specific about Africa. It relates to social policy everywhere, and it allows us to rethink it. So I would like to thank, our strategic partners, Kudesria, UNRISD, for staying the course, and Kudesria staying with us, working with us also in terms of the publication program for the conference. The most recently, released a book volume on social policy in the African context. Is an example of output from earlier conferences. I would like to thank the participants, because when we can make a call for paper, if you don't respond, well, there's a saying in my neck of the woods. When you have a feast, you thank those who made the food, those who are behind the the wall who make the food. But you also have to thank those who came to eat, you know. So and it wasn't just a question of coming to eat. It's a rich environment of exchange of ideas, of what you call insistence on thinking for ourselves, with ourselves, and by ourselves. And many of you, because of the time zones, there is the convenience of what do you call it, meeting online. You can come out of your bathroom, you can come out of your what do you call it, bedroom, and sit in front of your laptop, and you don't have to worry about traveling, 20 hours just to be at a conference where you're going to present for 10 minutes or 15 minutes. But the part of the limitations of that is that there are many of our colleagues who have had to wake up. Somebody in the United States who joined us yesterday was up at 1 a.m. And stayed on with us. There are people in Europe who are waking up at when we are 9 o'clock here, which seems convenient. There's 7 o'clock there, 8 o'clock, and so on and so forth. There are some of us who are early, birds. There's some of us who like our sleep. We have inconvenienced you, but we need to thank you for what has been, I believe, a rich, festival. Professor Jayati Ghosh has honored us with her presence. Professor Adebayo Olukoshi has honored us with his presence. Professor Fantu Cheru delivered the inaugural Tandika Kandawiri Memorial Lecture. And the family of Tandika was with us: Karina Claims, Andre Kandawiri, Joshua Kandawiri. And I would like to thank them. Thank the family of Tandika again for honoring us with the privilege of their consent for the memorial lecture program and this and that. I mean, Kodeswia has been just incredible. I'm Kodeswia, Bio's Kodeswia, what do you call it? This is where I cut my teeth as an intellect, as a scholar. I always said to people, when I won my first major grant from Kodeswia, which was the Reflections on Development program, I did not even know that there was anything called Kodeswia. I was asked, why don't you apply? And I applied, I didn't know anybody. So again, for those who think that to get into the Kodeswia network, you have to know anybody, I'm an example of not knowing anybody, got into Kodeswia purely on the basis of what I believe, let's hope, quality of the proposal that submitted. And Kodeswia remains our continental platform, the premier African Social Science Council. And I would like to thank them. We're using their platform, and they've been incredible, in support. For the first time, we're able to hold this conference as a bilingual event. And we're hoping that, in future, it's a lot more expensive if you're doing it in person and this and that. But they've supported us, with this. I'd like to mention Bashiru, who is the technical person at Kodeswia, who's been responsible for setting up the website and setting up the Zoom something. We had a bit of a glitch earlier on today. He responded very quickly to resolve the thing, And to Kaja, Kaja, we've known each other for quite a while. But I would like to extend our appreciation through you to Paul Ladd, who's the director of Honories, to Il-Chun Yi, another, long-term, colleague and this and that, and for staying the course with us. Honories is a research institute based within the UN, but it's our research institute, and so on. And the thing that connects all of us together is Tandika. Professor Pulen Lenkambule, the Vice Chancellor of University of South Africa, actually had to make a recording at 7 to 7:30 in the morning to leave for the airport at 8 o'clock. Okay? And initially we were saying, this is going to be too much pressure. She said, that whatever it takes, she will have to do it, and so on and so on. So I'd like to thank her, in addition to the incredible support from I belong to what they call the portfolio in UNISA under Professor Tenjua Meiwa, and incredible support from the portfolio. We are funded at the chair by UNISA, by DSI, the Department of Science and Innovation, and the National Research Foundation. And I would like to thank them because the generosity of the funding allows us to hold this conference without having too much. To members of the planning committee, Hanley Volhuta, Simangele Sitole, Doc Malambo at UNISA, my incredible appreciation. To the team at SPiA, Bashiru, Francine, what do you call it, Ibrahim, Shifau, and Godwin himself. I'd like to express my appreciation. And for this conference, in terms of the expansive understanding of the need to create a community of scholars around social policy in Africa, is the partnership that we celebrated during this conference, which is the GETSWA project, because pushing the boundary of the field of social policy in a way that is inclusive becomes quite important. And I would like to thank Professor Georgie Chikata, for that. We've had this book. I don't know if it's shown properly, displayed before. That came from an earlier edition of the conference, and we have a set of manuscripts going through publication program at the moment. We will come back to what they call it, the presenters, and inform you about the publication program. A lesson we learned from this, and this is where I come towards the end of my welcome address, farewell address for Thandika. It's about getting our ideas out there. And Thandika used to say, if you get your ideas out there, it cannot be ignored. At least it will have visibility and so on. And again, to thank, SPiA in terms of the ongoing partnership in this area. I look forward to seeing you all in November 2023 for the next edition. Thank you.
Jimmy, I was expecting you to hand over to the...
Okay, Professor Meiwa.
Yes, please.
Okay.
So much. Thank you so much for that, Prof. Adesina. As the 3 days go past, we've had Africa, Europe, the Middle East, and North America as continents. Actually, we've had more than 40 countries congregating over such an important and rich discussions on development, democracy, and policy, in particular social policy. My name is Tenjua Meiwa. I am the Vice Principal responsible for research, and our research chair, Professor Jimmy Adesina, is one of our stars that we're very proud of. Of course, I don't have to sing his praises. You've seen it all. We've participated in it all since 2017. We've gathered, we've met again since then to take stock of how and what decisions to take to bring about change. Over the past 3 days, we've met to examine, to celebrate successes, victories, but also to reflect and step back and plan for communities, societies, and national activities that we could, as individuals, collectives, universities, NGOs, organizations, research councils, etc., to bring about change. Having been participating in a few papers and keynote speeches. This has come out quite strong for me, and it is a leaf that I take out of these 3 days. In a recent article, one of Africa's distinguished scholars, SPiA, actually in a Codestria bulletin published this year, he makes this observation, which I quote in length. I quote, "Throughout the history of humankind, masses have been moved by the grand narrative of liberty, freedom, justice, emancipation to bring about change. Sometimes it's been revolutionary, at other times not so much." He further says, "Humanity stands at a crossroads. It is crying out for fundamental change. We need an alternative utopia to live by and fight for, if we are not to be consumed by the death and destruction wrought by the barbaric systems of the last 5 centuries. The worst of that barbarism," he says, "has been felt and continues to be enduring in Africa," at close quote. These last 3 days, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, colleagues all over the world in the 5 continents and 40 countries, these are words that very much for us at the University of South Africa, and for these 3 days have firmly reverberated our vision as a university, which is a vision which we say we're looking towards being the African university that shapes futures in the service of humanity. And it is actually that kind of a vision that has driven us to have and showcase the kinds of Prof. Jimmy Adesina, who continuously over time seek to find answers, educational answers, as we've seen, developmental answers, answers to the problems that we have. And we do this by forming the partnerships that we've seen and that we've enjoyed through these 3 days. So for me, as a vice principal responsible for research, I want to say farewell and congratulations, well done, on indeed ensuring that we have lived by, as a collective of 5 continents, over 40 countries, and the observations that SPiA makes, as well as have also made us look good as UNISA, because the work that we've done since 2017, that we continue to do now in the past 3 days, have anything but resounded these kind of visions and aspirations that we've seen through the work and celebration of Kadawire, a very dear fellow distinguished professor that we honor. And of course, this we've been doing through the campus of a transformative social policy. And thanks to everyone who's participated, as colleagues have thanked you. I don't want to go over that again and keep you long, but you've contributed. Congratulations. Contribution you've made in shaping the benefit that we seek to have started having from the social policy work that we've driven through the UNISA research chair in social policy. Thank you. Good afternoon, good morning. I appreciate and acknowledge you.
Thank you very much, colleagues, and all the very best as we go forward. I think this brings us to the end of the conference.
Well done.
Thanks, Godwin. Thanks, Godwin.